So hello, everybody. Today I'll be talking about the effect of aphasia identification cards on neurotypical comprehension of aphasic language. So some background terms to start. Aphasia is a communication disorder caused by some type of injury to the brain. It's most commonly a stroke, but it can be other things as well. And it affects a person's ability to produce and or comprehend language. And then self-disclosure, I'm going to be talking about that as well, specifically in the context of self-disclosing an aphasia diagnosis. And that's the concept of an individual communicating with others about a condition they have or some identity that they hold. So why this study? Basically, because aphasia is not a rare disorder. It is something that affects between 2 and 4 million people in the US alone, but lack of awareness of aphasia, about 84% of the general population doesn't actually know what it is. So it's really important in this field to be working on tools, finding tools and research that can help to create clinically applicable tools for people who have aphasia to communicate. The research questions we have: does self-disclosure using an ID card impact how neurotypical listeners process language produced by a speaker with non-fluent aphasia? And non-fluent aphasia is a specific type where the person actually has a little bit more difficulty with production as opposed to comprehension. And do aphasia ID cards impact neurotypical listeners' learning of language error patterns over time? So we can see on the bottom, this is the sample ID card that we created in the lab for the purpose of this experiment. It tells the participants that our speaker has aphasia, it tells them what aphasia is, and it gives some communicative strategies that people could use in conversation with this person. So this is an eye tracking study, and we tested 27 neurotypical participants, and we split them into 2 groups. So we had a card group. Those people saw the card before the experiment, and they learned that the speaker has aphasia. And then we had the no card group, and these people didn't have any information about our speaker in the beginning. And the linguistic stimuli were all recorded by a male speaker in his mid-50s with non-fluent aphasia, and every sentence was formed the same way. So they all filled the template of click on the X, and X would be where the target word goes. And I put a sound file in here, but I forgot to share my sound, so I'll play it after if we have time. So this is the experimental design. We had the card group, and this group was shown the aphasia ID card, as you can see, before the experiment began. And then the no card group didn't get any information. There were 3 blocks to the experiment. So 2 word picture matching blocks that collected eye tracking data. So the participants saw 2 pictures on the screen. They heard the instructions, click on the whatever the target word was, and then they clicked on the picture that matched the instruction the best. In between these 2 blocks was what was called an error observation block. So they weren't asked to do anything. They were just listening and watching the screen. And in this block, they saw only 1 picture on the screen, but they heard our speaker make what are called semantic paraphasias. And these are instances where he would say a word that was related in meaning to the target word, but it wasn't the right word. So as you can see here, we have a picture of a necklace, but our speaker said, click on the bracelet. So results. Our first question, which was, does self-disclosure using ID cards impact how listeners process language produced by the speaker? So these were all data taken from the pre-observation period before they saw that our speaker made these errors. And on the x-axis, we have time from noun onset of the target word. And on the y-axis, we have target advantage, which is the proportion of looks to the target image versus the distractor image on the screen. And then these 2 black bars, our first black bar is offset of the target noun, and then the second black bar is reaction time. So when the participants actually clicked on whatever image they chose. So we can see that the ID card group, the group who saw the card in the beginning, had a higher target advantage from the start. So even in the pre-observation block, they were looking more at the target image as compared to the group that had no information about the speaker. And then the second question was, do aphasia ID cards impact neurotypical listeners' learning of language error patterns more so over time? We have the same axes. The graph on the left shows just the no card group from pre to post observation. And we can see that after they viewed the evidence of these errors, they have a lower target advantage. So post observation, they're looking less at the target image and more at the distractor image. Whereas the card group on the right-hand side, we can see that their performance doesn't really change over time. So even though they see that our speaker makes these errors and they hear the errors that the speaker is making, it doesn't really change their performance of the pictures. So clinical implications. Aphasia ID cards are currently used and given as recommendations by speech language pathologists for the treatment of aphasia and for maintenance out in the real world. But it's really unknown whether they impact a listener's linguistic expectations of people who have aphasia. So do they promote conversation what's their effect on communication? Do they make it easier or harder for people to talk with someone who has aphasia? And so that's kind of where this area of research is going. So I'd like to thank the faculty members of my thesis committee, which are Dr. Jennifer Mack and Dr. Megan Gross, both are here today, and then the Neuroscience of Language and Aphasia lab members who assisted with my thesis, so Grace, Oneida, and Sarah. And I'm open for any questions.
Excellent job, Colleen. Thank you.
Thank you, Colleen. So we have a question for you. Were these tests time limited? If so, did you consider the spectrum of processing time that can be required by individuals?
Yes, so they were presented, basically the way that it went was they were presented with the pictures. So they had time to look at those pictures, and we looked at the eye tracking data before they even heard linguistic stimuli as well. And then they were presented with the sentence. And so then they were given the time afterwards to click on whatever picture corresponded with the instructions.
Thank you. Did you collect any information from your participants after the study about their perceptions of the speaker?
Yes, we did. So for the card group, they were obviously told that our speaker had aphasia before the experiment began. The no card group wasn't. And so we gave the no card group an exit survey where we asked them, you heard the speaker, you heard their errors in their language. What do you think was happening with the speaker? What kind of communication disorder do you think they had? And I have some data here. We had 4 of the 13 no card group participants who said aphasia. That was their first thought about what what the speaker had. One person said right hemisphere damage, one said semantic disorder, one said neurological disorder, but the rest of the participants said that they did not know. And then our second question for the exit survey was also asking them, when in the experiment did you come to this conclusion? So what part was it when you first heard them? Was it after you heard the errors? Was it right now when you're doing this survey? When did you come up with this idea? And all the people who had an idea and didn't say that they didn't know said during the experiment. So sometime between the first and third blocks.
This is related to that. Did any of your participants, and I'm thinking the person meant the listeners, have prior experience with people with aphasia?
Yeah, so the majority of our participants were from the communication disorders department, and the average number of ComDis classes taken by our participants was about 5.6 classes. So most of our participants had some potential explicit learning about aphasia. And if the study were to be replicated, we would probably try to get a more general population in our sample size. But the actual data as to whether someone personally knew someone with aphasia is unknown.
What are other factors that should be examined to better understand how aphasia ID cards affect communication?
Yeah, so I think besides just listener processing of the language, it's also important to take into account listener perceptions of somebody who has aphasia. So getting exposure to an aphasia identification card, you now know some information about a speaker that you didn't know before. And it is a medical diagnosis. And if you don't know so much about it, you might be thinking, okay, how does this affect this person's cognition? How does it affect their language? How does it affect their behavior? And so that's something that we have to take into account when we're recommending aphasia ID cards, like how are people going to perceive this person once they show them that they have this disorder? But also thoughts of the person with aphasia. Do they actually want to use the card? Do they think that it's beneficial to tell their communication partners about their diagnosis, or do they think it's better to not share that information? So there's a few different factors that definitely have to do with recommending them and their potential benefit.
Okay, looks like we're all set. Thank you so much, Colleen. That was wonderful.